Welcome to How the World Works. I am Kevin Williamson here with a guest named Sally Satel. Dr. Satel is a psychiatrist and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a writer of books and articles about kidneys, among other things, which I think we'll get to in a second. But the first thing I wanted to ask you is a question I ask doctors a lot, which is, why does anyone become a doctor? You hear me out here for a second. It used to be this very, high status occupation. The joke about, every mom wants her son to grow up to be a doctor. But if you're smart enough to be a doctor in the United States, you're smart enough to work on Wall Street. And, by the time you go through all the stuff you have to go through to be a doctor and residency and medical school and all that, you're in your 30s before you really start to make any money. There are lots of other occupations you can go into that would certainly be more lucrative than most medical practices are. Why do people become doctors?
Because life isn't about money, Kevin.
Some of it's about money.
Well, you actually can do very well if you do procedures, which every time I say that, it reminds me of The Graduate, when the friend took Dustin Hoffman aside and said, plastics. Yes, procedures. Now, psychiatrists, unless they do a lot of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and we really don't do a lot of that. In fact, it's really in specialized medical centers, don't make a lot of money compared to other doctors. Although, if you work like in a big city like DC or New York, you can my friends charge up to $600 an hour. That's not bad. I work in a methadone clinic, so let's just say I'm not making that. Yeah. But, almost all the doctors I know are academic physicians. And so their primary interest was really research. And the ones who do a significant amount of clinical work in their research institutions, just really love saving lives, love working with patients. Yeah. So it really is a humanitarian impulse that many of them have. I like to think most.
I had a doctor in New York, and he had a picture on his wall of this great collection of exotic sports cars he had. And I said, I think I probably pay you too much. And he said, do you want a doctor who can't afford a Ferrari? Which I thought was a fair question. How did you get on the path to becoming a psychiatrist? Is that something you wanted to do from childhood, or did it something you kind of fell into, or
No.
did you lose a bet?
It's a strange story that actually for the longest time, I just kind of felt almost a taboo against saying, but I'll tell you. And I did write a short article about it. When, believe it or not, when President Trump was on steroids because of his COVID, and there was a concern that it was affecting his mental status. One might ask how one could know, but in any case, but those drugs, prednisone, that's a typical one. They really can have what's called effects on one's mental status. That would be the mental status changes, kind of a formal term for it. And I happen to have experience with them myself. When I finished college, I wanted to be a biologist. I had a very romantic notion about field biology and descriptive biology and Darwin. Then I went to Cornell, which is in the country effectively, so did a lot of field work there. And then I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school to do evolutionary biology. And then my first year there, I developed a serious inflammation. And one of the standard therapies still today is steroids. They're very good at controlling inflammation, especially acute inflammation. And unfortunately, my doctor neglected to tell me it could have side effects. And it was a pretty high dose. And so within 2 weeks, I was effectively mad. I mean, I was profoundly depressed. At a qualitative level that I've really never had before. The kind where you'd kill yourself if you had the energy. And sleeping most of the day, crying the rest of it, sort of wandering like a zombie around Hyde Park. And then I could
You're
not...
about 25 at this point?
21.
21,
yeah.
okay.
And then I developed a kind of an aphasia, which is a word you typically hear in the context of stroke victims. And it comes in two forms. Receptive aphasia means I really couldn't understand what you were saying to me. And expressive aphasia, which is less common, means, oh, pardon me, I think I reversed them. I think expressive aphasia is somewhat more common, where you don't make that much sense when you talk. But I developed receptive aphasia. I didn't have any head trauma. This is really fascinating what some molecules can do to your whole cognitive capacity.
Hmm.
And I couldn't understand what people were saying to me. Just didn't make it just didn't make sense. And of course, reading didn't make sense. So the people in my graduate department were so nice. They let me take the semester, off. And then when my doctor tapered the steroids and the inflammation was resolving, then everything went back to normal. But it was a good 3 months, because as you know, once you've been on these medications, and I don't know why my doctor never kind of warned me that I could have some side effects. Typically people feel elated. That's kind of a more manic kind of effect. But in any case, when I tearfully told him, or didn't tell him, I said, "What the hell is going on?" And he said, "Oh, it's the effects of the medication. And anyway, it's time to taper, but it has to be a fairly slow taper. Otherwise, your adrenal glands will shut down because they've effectively been suppressed by the steroids you've been taking all this time." And so that took a while. So for about 2 months, I was having the symptoms I just mentioned to varying degrees of intensity, but when it was all over, I thought, there are people who go through this, and it's not because they took a medication. It's because their own innate neurotransmitters have effectively turned on them, and they may become, that was an age around early 20s, late teens is when schizophrenia first manifests, bipolar maybe a little later, but the psychotic illnesses, which are just devastating. And I just felt, this is happening to people, and it's frankly tragic. Not my case. I was very lucky and it was over. I mean, but I thought, my gosh, to have this problem, and then even if it does resolve, you never know. Sometimes the symptoms could reemerge, the medications. First off, maybe you can't find a medication that works well, or you're on one, but it loses its effectiveness. Anyway, to make a long story short, I dropped out of graduate school. I did finish. I did get a master's, which at the University of Chicago is a consolation prize. And then I went to medical school. And so I went to medical school knowing I wanted to be a psychiatrist, which is a little unusual. I think people often go to medical school trying to decide what kind of doctor they want to be. So that's up to date now.
Yeah, part of my misspent youth was spent studying linguistics, so I know a little something about aphasias. And it's a bad combination with depression, because one of the common outcomes of aphasias is suicide, because people get so estranged by not being able to communicate. And it's a real sort of consistent issue for people who suffer from those in particularly disruptive ways.
Yeah.
So there's medical school, there's residency. So you're in DC, where people are very status conscious. So here you don't very often have to explain to people which one's the doctor and which one's not a doctor when you're talking about psychiatrists and psychologists and stuff. But tell us a little bit about the steps of going, through that, what you actually have to do to become a physician.
Usually you're pre-med, although I wasn't a pre-med. I just happened to be a biology major. So most of the requirements I'd met them. But there's usually a pre-medical series with, organic chemistry and physiology and can't remember, but the obvious. And then you go to medical school. That's 4 years. And the first 2 years, I mean, I did go a while ago, but I think the organization is largely the same. Of the first 2 years being what's called preclinical, where you largely take big classes you do gross anatomy lab and pharmacology and pathophysiology and histology. Anyway, I don't know if they do histology anymore. I'm sure they don't use slides the way we did, the good old stained slides. But I feel like I'm ancient here. And then there's some introduction to how to do a physical exam, how to interact with the patients. I hope some basic medical ethics. And then the last 2 years are clinical, where you go from, you're the medical student on the surgery rotation, then the medical rotation, the OBGYN, and then you go off to residency. and that's no longer general. You decide what kind of a residency you're going to take. And again, that was obvious to me. It would be psychiatry, and they differ in the amount of years. Psychiatry was 4 years, 3 years. So there's 1 year of internship. Everyone's an intern, and then so there's medical school internship, and then a residency, which in psychiatry is 3 years. Uh, it's really, it has been a while, but I think some are 4 and even 5 years. And then a lot of people do fellowships.
Hmm.
So if you were a surgeon, you might do a fellowship in plastic surgery or transplant surgery or that kind of thing. And then you can go out on your own and put out a shingle, although that's happening less and less. Or you can go out sort of on your own and work for Kaiser, or a group, and that's much more common than solo practitioners. Or you can, be an academic, work in a university.
So when you were done with your formal education and ready to make that decision about what to do, how old were you at that point?
Well, let's see. Well, when I did residency, I
If
guess.
you're in graduate school at 21, you're moving through college pretty quickly.
Yeah, I guess I was in my late 20s when I finished my medical school. 24. My gosh, I didn't write this out. I don't know my timeline off the top of my head, but mid 20s. And then I did the residency from 84, from 84 to 88 at the West Haven VA. And that actually was very formative, though, in shaping my career in a sense,
Tell me
because
about it.
working at the VA hospital was really enlightening. It was Vietnam era vets and Vietnam vets. And you may know that PTSD, which is a phenomenon that the Greeks documented. I mean, ever since there was war, there's been, or any kind of traumatic experience, there's always been PTSD, which it technically really is a fear reaction that doesn't extinguish once the threatening stimulus goes away. That's kind of the core of PTSD. It's considered an anxiety disorder. And but it didn't enter the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the standard APA, American Psychiatric Association Compendium of Diagnoses. It didn't enter it till 1980, and that was in the DSM-3. And there were other diagnoses that probably could have fit, but it really became codified. And this was largely through the work of Robert J. Lifton had a lot to do with that, actually, and also a psychiatrist named Dr. Robert Spitzer, and so that diagnosis basically came into existence in 1980, and I started at the VA in 1984. So, I mean, right now, everyone, on the street knows what PTSD is practically. But then...
And they all think they have it.
Well, we do tend to over-medicalize in this society, no question about that. So, so basically, it was fascinating. The VA, of course, had patients who had schizophrenia and all the other depression, anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, everything else. So, we took care of those folks. But there was enormous emphasis and funding going towards the treatment of PTSD. And unfortunately, I don't doubt that everyone thought they were doing. They all had great intentions, but they sort of approached it in ways that now we see were so counterproductive. One thing we did was put a lot of these guys inpatient. Now, if you're that sick that you need to be hospitalized, that's fine, and you should be an inpatient. But most care can be delivered as an outpatient. And the reason that's important, it's not a matter of money, although inpatient is always more expensive, is because you want people to be with their family, be in their community, not be estranged from them in any way. And a lot of the therapy that you will be doing involves the family, because when someone has PTSD, or let's just say post-traumatic symptoms or post-war symptoms, I would say, men, I'll say men because it was almost all men at the time, can be drinking too much, there's domestic violence, they're often not working, there's an enormous amount of tension in the home and chaos, so you always want to involve the family as well. But we took these guys into the hospital, and a lot of them almost recreated a platoon. It was almost a regressive kind of a therapy. There was a lot of cathartic work. And, when someone is fragile, it's not such a good idea for them to reenact what they did or think they did or want you to think they did, get involved with. So, and on top of that, those dynamics, we I'm talking about the VA, makes service-connected disability money available to veterans. Again, not in any way against that. These men have sacrificed their life, and if they haven't sacrificed their life per se, in fact, only 15% of Vietnam veterans were actually in the infantry. But still, they've made significant sacrifices, and some of them have had jobs. You can be a truck driver, and so you're not in combat, but there are IEDs. I mean, your truck could blow up, so there's ample reason for a lot of stress. But we would help these guys get service-connected money. And I would say that if somebody has been through therapy, has tried hard to become more functional, and their symptoms are just overpowering, then of course we should make their lives not even easy, but possible with financial benefits. But we had way too low a threshold for making these benefits available. We made them available to people who were rehabilitatable, and then we turned them into psychiatric invalids. Because if you get money and you're in a fragile state psychologically, and the message is basically, well, you are disabled, you're not going to be a productive member of society, then that's something you will start to incorporate into your sense of yourself and your abilities. And then the longer you don't work, your skills atrophy and your confidence erodes. And then you're afraid to even try to go back in the workforce, because then if it doesn't work, you'll have lost the money that supported you. So I have a complete sympathy for veterans who, once they got on this, were too afraid to come off it because it would risk too much. But the VA, to my best understanding, still has this a policy where a veteran can approach the disability house, so to speak, that side of the Veterans Administration, the Veterans Benefit Administration, I think it is, and then there's the Veterans Health Administration. You can go to the Benefits Administration without ever going through health with that door first. So. And they don't require you. They will assess you for service-connected funds, which are very generous if you get, and should be, if you get total and permanent, and it's tax-free. But you can go through the door of benefits, and they can declare you disabled. And I'm sure they recommend, you really should get some help for this, but that's not a requirement. And to me, that's like, being in a car accident, and you're in the hospital, and 3 days later they bring over your permanent wheelchair and your permanent monthly check, and you're saying, wait, I haven't had surgery, I haven't had physical therapy, don't write me off yet. And I don't believe the VA for a minute saw themselves as doing that, but really effectively that's what happened to a lot of these men. And it was very frustrating. And then there was another frustrating development. I was working on I was directing the substance abuse treatment unit, is that when the checks came due, the guys who had a drug problem would spend it on drugs. So we were effectively subsidizing their addictions.
Yeah.
And so some colleagues and I had come up with this idea where, well, maybe they could sign over their checks. Is asking a lot, but and we could help them manage the money, so they didn't have any discretionary funds, and they could earn that back with, like, giving us clean urine toxes, or contributing in some way, being productive, applying for a job, working at a job, even working in a sheltered workshop, which the VA had. And actually there's one VA in California, at least one VA that's actually doing that. But we always wanted it to be almost like part of the policy. And kind of ironically, that was part of the policy over at the Social Security Administration, because right around the time I was we're all getting so frustrated with our patients spending money on drugs, I became aware of a program through Social Security called DANA, Drug Abuse and Alcoholism, and it was developed in 1972. And again, good intentions. The idea is that if you were disabled because you were, doesn't quite say it this way, but this is clearly what it was. If you were disabled because you were too intoxicated to work, we will send you a check. But to be fair, well, first off, the check wasn't a lot of money, but we'd send you the check. And however, the check would go to what's called a designated payee. So it would go to your mom or your brother or someone who responsible person, and they would make sure that your utilities everything was taken care of. And and they would basically watch this money, and if probably, one would hope, kind of give it back to the patient in a sense, in the way that we thought about doing that at the VA, kind of as an incentive to get better. And so some of our patients would get that funding as well as their money from the VA. The thing is with the what's called DANA program, drug abuse and alcoholism, some people had a bartender as a representative payee, or their dealer, and they didn't go to treatment. I left that out. That was also an expectation of getting that money. So on paper, that all made sense. But if you understand people with drug problems, it's pretty naive to think that's the way it would work.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time writing about Appalachia and poverty in that part of the world. And there was one town I visited where the only place to cash a check actually was a bar, and that was not a good sign, I didn't think. Your work on addiction, I think, would safe to be say that it's controversial in some ways. Certainly been some interesting back and forth conversations there, which puts you in an interesting position, I think, professionally, in that you're not to flatter you, but a well-regarded practitioner in what you do, but you're also someone who's pretty critical of your profession in certain ways, and some of its institutions. Psychiatry is a pretty small world. Is that uncomfortable to be in that position of being a very vocal, very public critic of your industry? Because it's one thing to make suggestions at committee meetings. It's another thing to write in the Wall Street Journal.
I have a lot of what I call senior colleagues who are just wonderful and really wise people. I'm not saying there aren't wise younger psychiatrists as well. Of course there are, but these are the ones I know because I trained with them, and there's no problem. And a lot of them are critical as well. But they're just not in the their culture of writing is in peer reviewed venues or in chapters somewhere. And a lot of them are in a way conflict avoid. They just don't want to, but they agree. And I think they're often kind of thankful that, someone may be questioning things. You may be specifically referring to one of my big points of resistance with the establishment, or at least the National Institute of Drug Abuse as an establishment, where since 1995, they have been, or officially 1997, have been designating addiction a brain disease. Is that what you have in mind?
Some of it, yeah.
And from the day I heard it, and it's so ironic that I was there at a meeting sort of when it was floated to a group of what are called stakeholders, but basically people who get grants from NIDA. And the director at the time said, we're thinking of, it's basically a rhetorical move because there's no scientific evidence for such a claim. We're thinking of calling addiction sort of a brain disease. Kind of, what do you think? And my recollection is there was a show of hands, and it was most people. And that director had worked for the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and in that domain, it makes a lot of sense to say schizophrenia is a brain disease and bipolar illness. That makes sense, and it also, I think that their experience at NAMI was that it garnered more sympathy and maybe even more receptivity to research funding and coverage of insurance coverage for people with severe mental illnesses. So I think he thought it would transfer to addiction,
Mhm.
but they're so different. And so I've basically been arguing against that for, my gosh, it's going on almost 30 years. And I frankly, I still do, because I find it just so terribly misleading. Um, so if I'm telling you, I don't even say it's not a brain disease, because of course drugs affect the brain, and of course neurocircuitry is altered, and of course there are genetic differences between people that make those differences more compelling in some folks physiologically than in others. All that's true, but so I don't say it's not a brain disease. I just say that depending on who you are, that's probably not the most productive level of analysis in which to think about addiction. So, of course, you can think about it at the level of the brain. And in fact, the people who run NIDA have been neuroscientists for the last, about 3 decades now, and or at least over two. And they have, one of them has been very instrumental in pioneering PET scanning, and now people don't use PET that much. I think they use functional fMRI, but it's brilliant technology, and it's amazing that you can visualize the activity, the brain activity of someone who took cocaine, and do before and after. I mean, that is amazing. The question is, what does it tell you about the capacity of a brain, meaning a person, to, let's say, respond to incentives, or to stop using drugs when they no longer serve a purpose, or when your life improves and you don't need them anymore. So the reason that I object to that reductionist view is that it just telescopes it down to one level,
Mhm.
the neurobiological level, when there's so much more. There's the psychological level, and the social level, and the behavioral level, and the cultural level. And when you narrow it that way, the implication is that medications are the cure. Look, I work in a methadone clinic, so I am all for medications. But if that's all there was, all our patients would be cured, right?
Right.
Because they wouldn't be withdrawing, because that's what methadone does. It's a synthetic opioid that is a replacement effectively for heroin, fentanyl, oxycodone. And if that's all their problem was, that's why even that book Dope Sick bothered me a little bit, because the implication was that you're continuing to use because you're withdrawing. And to be fair, at a sort of the 5-foot level, that is true. If a person feels that their heroin or whatever is wearing off, and alcohol, they will drink more to suppress that feeling. But that is driven by a much deeper need. And that's what effectively is revealed in a methadone clinic, because you've stripped the physiology away from the psychology. You've got the person. Why do you still want to use cocaine while you're in a methadone clinic? Why do you still use heroin from time to time while you're in a methadone clinic? Because there are these underlying problems. And so when you think of addiction as a brain problem, it just blinds you to all that. You don't even think about that. Plus the fact that incentives are very powerful ways to get people to stop using. So a very smart psychologist, Gene Heyman, he who's written about written a book called Addiction is a Choice. And what he means by that, it's certainly not, oh, I could take it or leave it. I mean, it's a choice, but it's often a hard one to make. But that using drugs is a voluntary behavior, specifically that it's a behavior that can be modified by foreseeable consequences. And when people walk into this methadone clinic, I mean, 99.9 times out of 100, it's, my wife is going to leave me. My kids hate me. My boss is going to fire me. My probation officer is going
Going
to
to jail.
violate me. Those are consequences. Now, those are negative consequences, so to speak, or those are sanctions. You always like to use incentives if you can, like what will be the reward? And the reward is implied. Obviously, if I change my behavior, my wife will like me and my kids will. But again, if you have a brain disease, which implies, and in fact, some of the rhetoric from the NIDA folks is that drugs destroy free will. I mean, as if you truly had a stroke or some kind of real neurobiological event. But clearly that's not true, because people can modify their behavior when the consequences change. And the most beautiful illustration of this. I used to be one of the few people who knew it, but now I mean, it may even be familiar to you, the Vietnam veteran story. Do you know that? Oh, good. Okay. You could teach a whole class in addiction off this. Um, so in 1971, when President Nixon started getting news from uh, Vietnam officers and medical folks, I think, that there was a lot of use of heroin and opium, and this is really good heroin, that they were among the guys, the GIs, that he was panicked that they would bring their habits back to America, and heroin that was one of the heroin uh, epidemics around then, the early
Hmm.
70s. And so they devised a program with Jerome Jaffe, the psychiatrist, who's one of my like-minded colleagues. He's wonderful. He just had his 80th birthday. And so he devised this program with a spectacular name, Operation Golden Flow. And basically it was you pee in a cup, and if there's no heroin in there, you can leave. You can go back to the States. If there is, you're not going. Now, we will offer you detox on site, or you can just stop now that we caught you, so to speak. But, you know, these are the rules. So the vast majority of folks, and there was estimated that around maybe a quarter, 15% to a quarter, were really addicted, not just using it, also
Hmm.
heavy marijuana use, but they cared about the heroin. So when they tested most people, they actually managed to just stop. And there were good reasons. I should go back and say there are damn good reasons to use heroin in Vietnam. First off, you're bored to death. When you're a soldier, you're bored, or you're terrified. And a lot of people who use drugs will use more of them when they are bored.
Hmm.
So boredom is a real risk factor, and also terror, and also probably again a post-traumatic and a pre-traumatic, because they're very very anxious about what's going to happen, frankly, tomorrow or in the next 5 minutes. So there was a lot of fear. There was also a lot of demoralization, especially towards the end of the war. A lot of reason to just want to escape. Plus, the stuff is there. It's totally normalized. I mean, every condition possible to encourage almost drug use is right there. But when you come home, none of it's there. It's not around you. You have to go to some scary part of town to get it. Remember, this is before cell phones, and you can meet someone in a
Right.
McDonald's parking lot. And plus, your wife and your kids. It's just the most radical change of environment and mindset. The expectations are different. The consequences would be different were you to try to continue to use. People, the vast majority of them just got back to work, which is not to say some of them didn't have, again, PTSD type symptoms, but they didn't return to drug use. In fact, the minority over the 3 years, about 12% relapsed during that 3-year period. And most of them had a heroin problem before they even went to Vietnam,
Hmm.
which is such a typical story. It also explains the OxyContin story, which is to say that the vast majority of people who got their OxyContin from a doctor, and that was not the majority, but who got their medication from a doctor and then developed an addiction were people who had alcohol or drug problems
Yeah.
before. That is almost like an iron rule of addiction. So anyway, so the Vietnam story is amazing, and it just says a lot about how context, environment, expectations, cues. I didn't mention that, but that's just like almost a Pavlovian type of phenomenon. Well, it is a Pavlovian phenomenon where it is very prominent with stimulant drugs, but where if you are around, as they say, people, places, and things that you associate with drug use, you are pretty likely, if you're still fragile in your recovery, to experience a real rush of craving, and that makes you quite vulnerable. So So a big part of therapy or counseling is relapse prevention work, where you learn how to, for example, things that make common sense but probably don't occur to you. Don't drive by your dealer's house. Do not drive that way. Drive a different way. Do not get your paycheck. Get it direct deposited. Do not. And then some of them are really idiosyncratic, like a teacher who used powder cocaine and found that the chalk would kind of get him so he had to
Oh
use
no.
a whiteboard, or
Yeah.
someone else who would actually would actually find himself wanting drugs just looking down at his arms. He injected where he had some
Scarring.
scabs,
Yeah.
and so he always wore long sleeves. Now, admittedly, a lot of people wear long sleeves because they just don't want anyone to see them, those stigmata, as it were. But
Yeah.
he did it also because he didn't want to provoke craving. And there are all kinds of idiosyncratic things. Don't listen to a certain song. Internal mood states can bring this kind of thing on. Anyway, that's all packed into that Vietnam story.
When we first started this conversation, I very cleverly built in the theme of incentives, not knowing that you were going to give me Operation Golden Flow as a potential
Yeah.
segue into talking about kidneys. But let's talk about kidneys.
Oh, okay. Well, that's another one
You've
of
had
my
some.
issues. Yes, I've had a few. um,
4, I guess.
well, 2 new ones, yeah, and they actually leave the old ones in place unless they were diseased in some way. So, but then things atrophy. So, yeah, I was just minding my own business in around 2004, and I had a checkup. Probably hadn't had one in 10 years, and felt fine. But one of the lab tests was really deranged. And this is a lab test that would be on anybody's basic, panel of tests. And it's called creatinine, for what it's worth. And it's usually between 1, if you're a big guy, maybe up to 2, but usually around 1. And but mine was like 5, which is really out of whack. And but there's a rule of physiology that when any of your blood tests are out of whack, like your liver function tests, or even people with Parkinson's disease, that almost 90% of an organ has to be destroyed if it happens incrementally. If it happens slowly over years, decades sometimes, you don't feel anything till the vast majority of that organ is gone. If my creatinine hit 5 overnight, I'd probably be unconscious,
Yeah.
But so I felt okay, but it was kind of an inexorable sort of deterioration, and so I knew I'd need a kidney, and I knew from just from my days in medical school, and that dialysis is awful. Admittedly, I always am scolded by saying that, because it is true that without it, you'd be dead. I mean, if God forbid your liver were destroyed overnight and you didn't get a liver transplant, you would die. There are no bridging technologies. In hearts, there are some. I mean, Dick Cheney had one.
Yeah.
But even that doesn't. I don't think those last years and years. Whereas dialysis can last a while. But you want to avoid it at all costs, because your life will still be foreshortened relative to getting a kidney from a living person, which is the best. Getting a kidney from a cadaver is second best, and staying on dialysis is, I suppose, third best, and then you'd be dead otherwise. I mean, those are your options,
Yeah.
basically. In a while, I hope in 10 to 20 years, you'll get a pig kidney, but we're not there yet, transplanted pig kidney.
Mhm.
That's really exciting work. And I think when you have your grandkids have kids or whatever, you'll say, there was a day when we had to rely on other people to donate their organs. And
It'll seem savage
oh
in
my
retrospect.
God. Yeah, because you'll be able to literally pick a kid,
Get it on Amazon, probably.
well, they'll have to be genetically altered to fit you, and then you won't be on the immunosuppressant medications.
Amazon will have your genetic
have their
profile by
own-
that point.
It
so,
probably would.
yeah.
I knew I needed to find a kidney, but I really wanted to buy one.
Yeah.
That's how I wanted it.
But you
I
can't do it.
didn't want it from a friend because that's the last thing I wanted was that sense of strangulating what I imagined to be just strangulating obligation. And if it were a close friend, in a sense, it would just almost distort the relationship in some way. I guess I could see people thinking, well, that's odd. Wouldn't it just make the relationship better? But I really think it would curtail some of the honest exchanges you could have
And you
with
can never
people.
make them pay for lunch again.
Yeah. Oh, I never let Virginia pay for anything. I wish I could, buy her a Tesla.
So you mentioned Virginia. This is Virginia
Oh, sorry about
Pastrell.
that. Yes,
who
jumped
is
ahead.
a well-known writer and former editor of Reason Magazine and many other things.
Right. But yes, spoiler alert, you cannot buy a kidney. It's been illegal ever since the 1984 National Organ Transplantation Act, which basically developed the so-called list.
Mhm.
It's a big national registry of people who need every kind of organ.
And you think that's the wrong approach?
I do.
We'll
But
talk about that some.
oh, I'm getting there.
Okay.
So yes, long story short, Virginia, it was very hard to find someone. And but thank goodness a mutual friend saw her at a party, and when she said, "How's Sally?" that person said, not so great. And God bless her. I mean, really, you're just, speechless with gratitude over something like that. But yes, I have long thought, I'm not the only person, certainly. In fact, Richard Epstein was one of the first people that I read who was vocal about this, the law professor at the University of Chicago, very market-oriented man, that, we should be able to, I like to say, instead of being able to buy kidneys, we should be able to reward people who are going to save our life. Or save someone else's life. And as I said, I'm not the first person to come up with this. Ever since the organ list, so to speak, went live in 1987, there's been a shortage. From day one, there's been a shortage. And so you can imagine over all these years, almost 40 years, that it's just accumulated. It's just gotten so that, 1 day from today, 12 people would have died because they didn't get a kidney. So, and these are avoidable deaths if we had enough, except that the society is wedded to this concept of altruism, that kidneys have to be given for free, altruistic. Well, I'd say Virginia still committed a very altruistic act. That was certainly quite a sacrifice on her part. But they mean it in, basically give it for nothing.
The idea is money's dirty.
Yes. And, Al Gore, in fact, when he was on the head of the Science and Technology Committee, I think, he was maybe he was head of that too, but wasn't he the head of oversight in the House during one of his years? Well, in any case.
Don't recall.
He was the one who spearheaded this NOTA legislation. And as it became clear that there still might not be enough organs, and this mainly was deceased at that time. It wasn't until the 90s that immunosuppressive technology really took off. But not enough people die in sort of an acceptable way so that their organs are usable. And he kind of foresaw correctly that there would not be enough kidneys if we had to rely on cadavers. And even he suggested during one of his speech during one of his hearings that, we might be able to use incentives. And because it was the age of the cadaver kidney, it was like a funeral benefit or some kind of contribution to an estate. So he even mentioned it then. But anyway, fast forward, the law is still very much, it's a felony to give anything. The term is valuable consideration. For a kidney, I couldn't give you $50,000. I'd technically be committing a felony. And if you accepted it, you'd be committing a felony.
No.
It's only one person's been prosecuted for this in the history of the world. And even he was given a very light sentence. So I think there's a sense of like, you're still saving someone's life. But in any case.
I made the same argument for parental rights in the case of adoption, where we've got a really bad system for making those decisions. And people spend a lot of money on it. They pay, lawyers and consultants and stuff, and everyone gets paid except for the woman who gives birth to the child. And that seems to me probably the not the best way to handle those resources. And when I wrote that, people lost their minds. People got really, really upset
because you're commodifying,
selling babies.
Yeah, selling babies.
And,
well, yes, I am. I will give $1,000 to anyone who asks, poses an objection that I haven't heard before. And there may be out there, but I really want to know it because I want to have an argument for everything.
Send your emails
And
to.
yes, truly. So what's the problem with that? Well, what's that? Let me explain what the plan would be. And I've been developing this with colleagues, transplant surgeons, nephrologists, for forever. And even Virginia, it's so, frankly, so intuitive. I mean, she came up with it, the week after we had the transplant, which is
She had a lot of time to think.
not much. She was, believe me, she was back working like
Was
three
she?
days. Well, she was sitting down. Now, obviously, if you're a day laborer, you do have to take like 6 weeks off, but she's a mind laborer. And so the idea is to avert the two things that make rational people nervous. One is that someone who potentially could be offered money, would rush into this without really thinking it through and then kind of regret it afterwards. The other thing is that the other concern is that only rich people could participate in such a thing because I could pay you, but if someone needed a kidney but didn't have resources, they're out of luck. So how do you get around those glaring objections, which I think are valid? One is that you don't offer cash so that it's not attractive to desperately poor people, or you don't offer immediate cash. The other is that you build in a waiting period so that you wouldn't be able to get the reward. Now, what's the reward? Well, probably the easiest thing is a refundable tax credit that would be paid out over 10 years. Of one time I was thinking 50,000. Other colleagues of mine now think it should be 100. I have no problem with that because the cost savings for getting people off dialysis is tremendous.
Yeah.
7% of Medicare funds are spent on dialysis, which goes to less than 1% of all all Medicare recipients. So we're talking billions of dollars. So you would put in a delay. You would have the government be the payer, not the recipient. So that makes everybody eligible. And as I said, you wouldn't offer cash. You wouldn't offer a reward right away. I think I covered what those three big objectives are. And then you're down to basically arguing with people over things like, arguments, as Michael J. Sandel would say, arguments from corruption versus arguments from consequence. Yeah. You just mentioned the argument from corruption, and that's I respect Leon Cass tremendously, but we'd always argue about this, and that it's somehow dehumanizing or it commodifies the body. Well, as you alluded to before, everyone's commodifying this. The people who rent the OR are commodifying it. The people who perform the surgery are commodifying it. And to me, in a highly legitimate way, of course they should be paid for their efforts, their talents.
What do you think of the surrogacy market?
Oh, we're changing topics.
Well, as a point of comparison between these two things, it seems like the nearest analog we have for something that's.
I think if people are
in practice,
informed consent. They're of course physically healthy, because you can imagine. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of ways to corrupt this. You let people do it when they're really not healthy enough, and that hurts both people, the potential recipient and the person who's giving the.
There's a bad version of every market.
Oh, of course, yes.
Mortgages.
But it's no reason not to do it. I'm just saying things. But we really have to be vigilant about stuff like that. But do you mean eggs and sperm? I have no problem with that.
Yeah, I was talking about surrogate.
Surrogacy,
motherhood,
yeah. I also think that's legitimate. I mean, these are humanitarian and financial motives that intertwine. One example Virginia always gave that I found so compelling is, when firemen rush into the building to save you, you don't really say, "Are you a volunteer fireman? Are you getting paid?" If they save your life, that doesn't make the salvage any less amazing and their heroism any less incredible. And so I see it the same way.
Yeah.
I also don't care what people spend their money on, which is another thing that, I mean, there's a whole list of objections. Some are ridiculous. Like, what if people buy a Ferrari? Well, what if they do? That's absurd. And they're
great cars.
But for what it's worth, with the tax credit, they probably wouldn't be enough for that. But yeah, they're worried about, let's see, well, it's going to attract mostly people with low income. Frankly, to me, that's an empirical matter. I think it'll attract mainly graduate students. I mean, people with earning potential, because there's a level of education you need not to feel more at ease with this. And I mean, it's been well established that people with lower levels of education are just more, more uncomfortable around surgical interventions, this kind of thing. But even if it were someone who was low income, if they're they have informed consent, if the reward is ample and not trivial. Exploitation is when you don't give someone enough, but they're not exploited. When they when gratitude is expressed, when their safety is ensured, how is that not respectful? I mean, commodification is when, to me, I mean, that's supposed to be a conversation stopper, that word. Okay, yeah, you're right. Commodification. Ooh, we don't want to do that. Well, what do you mean exactly by that? And often when you listen, it's like it was really talking about a lack of respect and treating the person like they are their kidney, treating the people like they're treated in a black market, which of course this is the solution to. But then some of the other folks, people the loyal opposition will say, but you'll just create a black market if you do this. And I say, my gosh, you don't have to be Milton Friedman to know it doesn't work that way. This is the solution to the black market. So anyway, there is an experiment in the world. It's not even an experiment. It's not considered experimental anymore, but it's a natural experiment. Iran actually pays people for their kidneys, but they do it in a way that sort of as proof of concept. It's helpful because in some provinces where they seem to do it, I guess, better than others, they actually have a waiting list of people to donate as opposed to the waiting list of people to get the kidneys. But they do it in a way that the recipient does often have to pay in. And I don't know how good the follow-up, the medical follow-up for the donor is. It's not a system that we want to emulate, but
free market libertarian paradise of Iran.
It does show that it works. And why wouldn't it? Every time we reward people for doing something, we get more of it. And if I can say, that's another objection some people have, is they say with certainty you'll get a crowding out phenomenon, which is the idea that you were going to go help at the shelter, but you found out that now they're paying people to help at the shelter, so you're not going to help at the shelter anymore, because that kind of dilutes the meaning of your activity, because you wanted to do it for free. To which I would answer, well, how altruistic were you in the first place? I would say that for every person like you who said, well, now I'm not going to help. Almost sounds so petulant. Well, now I'm not going to help, but 25 more people will. So net, it'll be a real increase. Now, can I prove that? No, I can only say it probably happens in every other possible situation in the world where something that was once free is now being, you can benefit from financially. But yeah, so let's do pilot trials. And there's actually a bill in Congress that would allow that, but it's just very slow progress. Yeah.
We get ready to wind down the conversation here a little bit. One question I do like to ask people often is, are you entirely glad that you chose the career path you did in life? Is there something else you might have done? If you have, do you ever think about, if I weren't doing this, I would be doing something else, and what would it be?
No.
No second thoughts?
None. I actually feel incredibly lucky. I never had a branch point where I said, should I do this or do that? In terms of things that really were kind of radically different, or even different enough, I suppose, that if I followed the trajectory, all the way out, would put me in a very different place than I am. No, I really do feel lucky. Everything seemed like the inevitable next step. And, I do miss And you alluded to this before, I guess, maybe about being a little estranged from my profession, so to speak. I mean, yesterday I listened to a talk given by a really wonderful addiction researcher. He's at McLean at Harvard, and he gave the talk at Columbia, and I watched it on the virtues of Zoom, and then I could watch it on Zoom, and I missed him, and I miss that those kind of colleagues. When I work at the methadone clinic, I work with great nurses and counselors, but and I learn from them, and I like talking to them. But it's not like someone, with your background and where you can sort of ask, "Gee, what should I do when there's elevated clearance of cocaine and methadone? When people take cocaine, should we do this? Should we do that? What kind of strategies we should use, and how should we get blood levels and things like that?" I mean, there's not that kind of. I don't have that kind of collegial experience.
It was good extemporaneous technical art.
Yeah,
level.
the curbside consult. I really miss that a lot, and I'm a little. I feel kind of out of the loop. That I know that if I were still in my department at Yale, I know the studies that were all underway as opposed to seeing a lot of them when they finally come out.
Yeah.
And so, that I'm still trying to fix. But
Are you like a lawyer or a plumber where people ask you for free advice all the time?
not on air, but not that often. Maybe I'd say once every 3 to 6 months.
3 to 6 months. That's not too bad.
And I don't charge them.
Very good. Dr. Satel, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.